It was a machine of profound contradictions, a gleaming, modern prophecy of air superiority. Its engine sat behind the pilot, pushing instead of pulling, a design meant to house a massive 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. American and British pilots, taking it to the vast high skies of Europe, whispered its name with dread. P-39 Airacobra. They called it a fatal flaw in aluminum, a glorified death trap that simply choked above 15,000 feet. Its reputation was sealed by failure, a discarded weapon. But history does not always obey its critics. Somewhere on a forgotten front, a different truth was being written in the smoke of defeated enemies. This cast-off fighter, the one deemed America's worst, would ultimately carve out an astonishing legacy, etching a final, undeniable tally into the sky. Over 2,400 confirmed kills. How could such a magnificent concept fall so far? The P-39, the Airacobra, was born of genius, a radical departure from the fabric and wire biplanes that preceded it. It was supposed to be the future. Its cockpit entry, a side-hinged car door, spoke of effortless modernity. The pilot sat forward, protected by the engine placed directly behind him, a revolutionary shield. But the promise of this innovative engineering was shattered by a single, crushing omission. The necessary engine of a high-altitude war required an advanced turbo-supercharger, the heart that could gasp for thin air and still deliver lethal power. The engineers removed it. They traded high-altitude performance for speed and weight savings they believed would suffice. They were wrong. The consequences were swift and brutal. When the P-39 arrived in the skies of North Africa and the Pacific, it encountered the sleek, high-flying German and Japanese adversaries. It was a beautiful airplane, yes, but it could not climb. It could not contend. The pilots, men whose lives were measured in vertical feet, watched the enemy climb effortlessly above them, watching, waiting, diving. The machine that was supposed to liberate them instead held them chained to the lower atmosphere. The P-39 pilots flew with a hollow, mounting dread, knowing that altitude was life, and they had none. They felt cheated by the very nation that demanded their sacrifice. The emotional reckoning was immediate. The British, who received the first models under Lend-Lease, flew them once, recognized the deficiency, and immediately rejected the entire design. They saw not an Airacobra, but a flightless worm. The Americans, forced to use their own stock, found themselves wrestling with a beast that was simultaneously aggressive at low levels, yet utterly docile and vulnerable when it mattered most. Pilots called it heavy, sluggish, and ultimately a death sentence. To fly the P-39 was to concede defeat before the battle had even begun. It was simply not the right tool for the job that had been defined for it. The Airacobra was cast aside, deemed a failure, a monument to a brilliant idea that had been ruined by a compromise. This was the unanimous judgment of the West. It was the epitaph they had written for a machine barely out of the hangar. And yet, if we look closely at the flow of history, at the ceaseless machinery of global conflict, we find that discarded tools often find new hands. As the P-39s were retired to training duties or stockpiled in obscurity by the discouraged Western Allies, a tide of aluminum flowed eastward across the Arctic convoys into the vast freezing crucible of the Eastern Front. These were the same planes, the same mid-engine layout, the same car doors, the same fatal flaw in the stratosphere. But here, the war was different. Here, the combat was brutal, fast, and often fought low, just above the shattered earth, where the P-39 suddenly stopped choking and started roaring. The Soviet pilots received these failures with an astonishing, desperate gratitude. They looked past the limitations that had doomed the plane in the West and instead saw the weapon's terrifying, heavy-hitting core, that massive 37mm cannon. In their hands, the rejected fighter ceased being an altitude disappointment and became a low-level armored fist. It was here, in the cold air above the steppes, that the legend was quietly forged, built kill by kill, by men who understood that a tool's worth is defined by its context. How profound is the irony that the machine America dismissed as a liability became the very symbol of air superiority for its Soviet allies. The numbers whisper the truth that the critics tried to bury. 2,340. More than 2,400 confirmed aerial victories were claimed by the pilots of the Red Air Force flying the Airacobra. It was not a failure, it was merely miscast. The machine had been waiting, silently, for the right war, the right altitude, and the right desperate, brilliant hands to finally realize its terrifying potential. The judgment of aluminum had been overturned. The Airacobra was supposed to be a triumph of modern physics, a statement in polished metal that America had grasped the future of flight. Its lines were clean, almost predatory. It was sleek, the engine tucked safely amidships, placing the aircraft's mass close to its center of gravity. This centralized layout was meant to offer supreme maneuverability, and critically, it allowed that magnificent 37mm cannon to fire unobstructed through the propeller hub, a deadly, singular threat. This was the vision, a cannon-armed pursuit plane capable of stalking and destroying any threat in the high, cold air. But a brilliant vision is merely a blueprint until tested by reality. And the reality of air combat in the early 1940s was defined by altitude. The Luftwaffe and the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force knew the game: climb high, conserve energy, and strike down on the enemy. The P-39, for all its revolutionary flair, carried a technical burden that rendered its promise null. It was a victim of a crippling, almost unbelievable compromise made deep within the design halls of Bell Aircraft. The aircraft was designed to include a powerful two-stage turbo-supercharger, essential equipment that uses exhaust gases to compress thin air and feed oxygen to the engine at extreme heights. Without this device, the engine literally runs out of breath, its power rapidly dissolving with every 1,000 feet gained. In a move driven by bureaucratic pressure, cost-saving measures, and a fundamental misunderstanding of future combat demands, the vital turbo-supercharger was removed. What was left was a sophisticated low-altitude fighter, a magnificent ground-level machine. But the war was not fought solely at the treetops. Above 15,000 feet, the P-39 transformed from a predator into prey. Its engine, the powerful Allison V1710, saw its horsepower ratings plummet. Where the rival Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 could dance at 25,000 feet, the Airacobra was lagging, struggling, becoming heavy and desperate. British pilots, receiving the Airacobra early in the Lend-Lease exchange, were the first to face this tragic truth. They flew it once, felt the agonizing drop in performance as they climbed toward the ceiling of combat, and their verdict was immediate and damning. The aircraft, which they designated the P-400, was rejected outright for frontline service. They returned the planes, a stunning repudiation of American engineering. They saw no merit in a fighter that could not fight where the enemy chose to strike. The disappointment was a cold, bitter certainty. They expected a champion. They received a burden. The American pilots were left to manage the rejected inventory, forced to take the Airacobra into the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters. There, the sky felt immense, open, and hostile. The fighter's great flaws were cruelly exposed. Pilots spoke of the humiliation of being easily outclimbed by Zeros and chased by tenacious German fighters. The P-39 pilot never flew with the initiative. He flew in a constant state of defense, conserving his pathetic reserves of altitude, always looking up, always wondering when the hammer would fall. The very features that suggested modernity became liabilities. The car-style side door, which seemed so chic on the ground, became a perilous obstacle in a high-G, rapid emergency escape. Worse, The nose-mounted cannon, the aircraft's defining feature, was largely useless if the pilot couldn't reach the engagement zone in time, or if his speed was so lacking that the enemy simply pulled away. The potential for the mighty 37mm shell was eclipsed by the devastating certainty of vulnerability. It was this feeling of being technologically betrayed that wounded the pilots most deeply. They flew a heavy, underpowered coffin, capable of great things only if the enemy was gracious enough to descend to its fighting height. The Airacobra was not merely inadequate, it was unfair. Its sleek, deceptive appearance disguised a core inability to fulfill the fundamental requirement of aerial war, to control the vertical space. The P-39 was judged, found wanting, and relegated to the ranks of beautiful, frustrating failures. The only question now was where this cast-off aluminum would go to finally rust. The rejection by the West was absolute. The sleek, underperforming Airacobra became the awkward guest no one wanted to seat at the high table of war. The American and British focus was fixed on the high-altitude pursuit of bombers and the dogfights of the stratosphere. The P-39 was quietly routed out of sight, boxed, crated, and shipped on the punishing convoy-run route toward an entirely different theater of suffering, the Eastern Front. It was a massive, almost apologetic transfer under the Lend-Lease program. Here, the machine would not fight the war that had been designed for it, but the war that was actually happening. The change in context was everything. The vast, fluid front between the Soviet Union and the Wehrmacht was not a contest of delicate, high-altitude interception. It was a desperate, immediate, close-range brawl. Combat rarely ascended above 15,000 feet, often raging just above the mud, the tank columns, and the shattered villages. The Soviet pilots, desperate for any modern metal that could match the persistent aggression of the Luftwaffe, did not measure the P-39 by the standards of the West. They measured it by the thickness of its armor, the speed of its dive, and the sheer authority of its nose-mounted weapon. The disappointment of the American pilot instantly transformed into the eagerness of the Soviet pilot. They found that the very elements deemed fatal flaws in the West were, in the unique chaos of the Eastern Front, suddenly massive assets. The Airacobra's engine, gutless at 25,000 feet, delivered full, brutal power at the tactical altitudes where Soviet ground forces needed support. The plane's weight, which made it sluggish in a high-altitude turn, gave it ferocious stability and speed in a low-level dive, critical for the rhythmic tension-release pattern of attack and evasion. Then there was the cannon, that massive center-firing 37mm M4 gun. In the West, it was an inefficient curiosity. In the East, where ground attack capability was paramount and dogfights were decided in seconds of devastating burst, it was nothing less than a revelation. Its shells struck German fighters with staggering, immediate effect, often disintegrating them in a single, well-placed volley. The Airacobra was no longer a disappointing high-altitude escort. It had become a terrifying flying gun platform, a low-level hunter. Even the much-maligned car-style cockpit door found its purpose. Western pilots complained it was slow to open during a bailout, but Soviet pilots, accustomed to being shot down deep over enemy territory, quickly realized the advantage of the door after a forced landing. It allowed them to exit the cockpit instantly and roll away from a damaged, potentially explosive plane, a far cleaner escape than wrestling with a heavy, sliding canopy. What the West saw as a mechanical nuisance, the East adapted into a matter of survival. The Airacobra had found its theater. It was no longer chasing ghosts in the stratosphere. It was hunting Messerschmitts and Stukas right above the trenches. Its operational environment demanded agility and raw firepower below 12,000 feet, and there the P-39 excelled. The emotional temperature of the story accelerated dramatically. The rejection felt in the Mediterranean was replaced by a hopeful, fierce reliance on the vast Russian front. The pilots learned its quirks, they mastered its weight, and they began to trust its lethal cannon. The discarded tool had found the perfect task, achieving an unlikely salvation in the most brutal war theater imaginable. The stage was set for the Airacobra to cease being a mere footnote and begin its bloody, undeniable redemption. The Airacobra landed in the Soviet Union not as a prize delivery, but as a quantity of necessary, if flawed, metal. Yet here, far from the critical eye of the Royal Air Force and the U.S. 8th Air Force, its true nature began to emerge. The machine, dismissed as gutless above 15,000 feet, was suddenly a king in the chaos of the Eastern Front, where the air rarely calmed above 10,000. It was the moment the rejected tool found its purpose, and the ensuing carnage was the machine's fierce, undeniable vengeance against its critics. The sky over the steppes was low, thick with smoke, and violently contested. It demanded not climbing power, but immediate, close-quarters aggression. The P-39's speed at these lower levels, its ability to dive and pull away, was ferocious. When engaged, it was the 37mm cannon that spoke the final word. The massive, slow-firing shell was a terrifying entity. Where standard machine guns pecked, the Airacobra punched, often shattering the structural integrity of a Messerschmitt Bf-109 in a single, well-aimed strike. The Soviet pilots did not complain about the plane's limitations. They molded their tactics around its strengths with a brilliant, desperate ingenuity. Men like Aleksandr Pokryshkin, who would become one of the greatest Soviet aces of the war, found his mastery in the cockpit of the P-39. He quickly realized the secret: never get slow and never climb high. He perfected the Kuban shelf, a tactic utilizing staggered altitude layers, ensuring that the Airacobra always fought on the descent, maximizing the aircraft's stability and its speed advantage. Pokryshkin flew the P-39 for the majority of his career, accruing a staggering number of victories. He did not treat the machine as a hindrance. He saw it as a deadly extension of his will. The combat became a sensory immersion. A Russian winter scramble, the cockpit glass frosting over, the ground rushing up. The roar of the Allison engine, powerful and reliable below the clouds, was the sound of life. The rhythmic thump-thump of the 37mm cannon was the sound of death delivered. Pilots described the intense kick of the cannon in the nose, a brief tremor through the entire frame, followed by the sight of the enemy exploding into a plume of black smoke and debris. It was fast, brutal, and decisive. The Airacobra was no longer merely a fighter, it was a flexible fortress. It was used to suppress artillery, to strafe tank columns, and critically to savage the relentless German ground attack planes, which often operated at the same low altitudes. The aircraft's weight and speed became critical for the Soviet doctrine of Terran, ramming, a final desperate measure that demanded a robust frame. The P-39 handled the low-level violence that would have crippled a more delicate machine. The emotional connection between the Soviet pilot and the Airacobra was deep, almost familial. They nicknamed it Kobrushka, the little cobra, a term of genuine affection and respect. This intimate relationship was built on trust, forged in desperate situations. They knew its temper, knew its range, and unlike the frustrated Americans, they knew how to keep it away from the high, thin air that would doom it. The aircraft became legendary, the very sight of its distinctive silhouette carrying psychological weight. The German pilots knew what the cannon could do. To face a P-39 was to face the possibility of instantaneous explosive disintegration. The ultimate measure of this mastery was the kill count. The 2,400 victories, conservative estimates suggest it was closer to 4,000, were not abstract figures. They represented countless duels won by a machine everyone else had written off. It was the definitive proof that the flaw in the design was ultimately less important than the ingenuity of the pilot and the context of the fight. The P-39 had finally answered its critics not with excuses, but with a torrent of confirmed destruction. It achieved its final, powerful redemption, transforming its narrative from a tragedy of engineering into a triumph of adaptation. The Airacobra's spectacular, violent redemption in the East was not a story of a changed aircraft, but of a changed perspective. The metal, the engine, the flaws, they all remained exactly as Bell Aircraft had delivered them. The P-39 lacked the turbo-supercharger in 1941 when the British rejected it, and it still lacked it in 1944 when Pokryshkin flew it as his personal weapon. The machine's capability was fixed, yet its narrative was radically altered. This transformation offers a poignant, universal truth that transcends the history of aviation. The Airacobra's tragic flaw was not inherent. It was entirely contextual. The Western Allies needed a high-altitude interceptor to protect bomber formations and secure air superiority above 25,000 feet, a mission the P-39 was structurally incapable of performing. Its failure was measured against an impossible benchmark. Its life was judged by a metric it was never built to achieve. But on the Eastern Front, the air war was fought beneath the clouds, closer to the grinding realities of the land war. The benchmark shifted. Here, the requirements were durability, low-level speed, and overwhelming immediate firepower. In this new theater, in this desperate, smoky crucible, the Airacobra was not merely adequate. It was peerless. This shift reveals a powerful emotional insight into human ingenuity. The P-39 was not redeemed by a redesign, but by adaptation and mastery. The Soviet pilots, facing an existential threat and desperate for any edge, did not waste time mourning the plane's deficiencies. They ruthlessly exploited its strengths, the reliability of the Allison engine below 12,000 feet, the devastating impact of the 37mm cannon, the structural toughness. They did not fly the P-39 they wished they had. They flew the P-39 they were given, and they molded it into a terrifying weapon. They accepted the burden and turned it into a battle honor. The final tally, over 2,400 confirmed kills, stands as a silent, unanswerable rebuttal to the initial judgment of America's worst. It is the weight of proof, forged in fire, that defines the Airacobra's true legacy. The legacy is not found in the disappointment of the engineers or the frustration of the American pilots, but in the fierce pride and survival of the men who flew it and lived to tell the tale. They saw a cannon wrapped in a fighter frame, and they found the war that needed exactly that. The initial dismissal was an arbitration based on theory. The final score was an arbitration based on survival. The tale of the P-39 Airacobra is ultimately a reflective commentary on perception itself. We are so often focused on what a tool lacks that we fail to see the unique power of what it is. It reminds us that failure is not an inherent trait of an object or a person, but rather a measurement taken in the wrong environment, under the wrong set of expectations. The machine had been waiting, patiently, for the sky that was low enough for its breath. The sleek fuselage of the P-39, designed for one war and achieving immortality in another, leaves us with a profound, lingering question. How many other rejected masterpieces, how many other discarded tools, how many other hidden strengths await only the right context and the right desperate hand to achieve their profound, unintended glory?